I'm so deeply honored to be here today with all of you and with this fantastic institution. And I just want to thank also especially Professor Darepa Konur, who helped organize this talk today and the many, many emails we went back and forth over the last many months. So thank you so much. So I wanted to just begin with a few comments about the field of comparative religions and ecology, which I've been a part of for the last almost 35 to 40 years. And I began this work with a group in India called the Swachha Ganga campaign, which many of you might be familiar with in Benares, with V.B. Mishra ji. And he was a Hindu priest in Benares as well as a civil engineer. And one of the things that I was very struck by, this was in the mid 80s, and there was a group in San Francisco called the Swachha Ganga Campaign, Friends of the Ganges, that I worked closely with for a few years. And while I was doing that work with Swachha Ganga Campaign, I was struck by several interesting contradictions because prior to that work, I had always assumed, like many of us, that as long as you make a natural object, such as a river or a mountain, and impute a kind of sacrality through religion to it, that would be necessary and sufficient to actually conserve that particular physical manifestation. It turned out from the example from the Ganga, as many of us who might have gone and bathed in the Ganga, it's extremely polluted. So how can one reconcile the pollution of a goddess, right? And so that was really a surprise to me, and a surprise, I think, also to even people like V.B. Mishra. How can that contradiction be held in the Hindu popular mind? And one of the striking things that I figured out, and it was like a puzzle with V.B. Mishra, was that sometimes it's the very fact of sacralizing nature that can prevent it from being conserved. So if the Ganga is a goddess, or when the Ganga is a goddess, then a Hindu could easily believe that the human cannot impact the goddess, cannot hurt the goddess. So therefore, no matter what the human does, it won't affect her, right? And so she is immune to being affected by the pollution of human beings. So it's the very belief in the river as a goddess that sometimes can act as a preventive from even seeing the pollution and acting on the pollution. So we realized that it was the imputing of a goddess imagination to a river is necessary but not sufficient. So I wanted to just put that there as a contradiction. This is not just in Hinduism, it's in many religious traditions. When you look at comparative religions and environmental studies, you find this phenomena across many religious traditions. So for example, even in ancient Greek mythology, you find the similar kind of phenomena. There's a brilliant book that's come out with the Harvard professor, Professor Kimberly Patton, in the field of religious studies. And she's written a gorgeous book called The Sea Can Wash Away All Evils. And in ancient Greek myth, the idea, very similar to the goddess tradition and in terms of the Ganga that we have in Hinduism, you also see in ancient Greek mythology, where if there is someone who has committed a sin, for example, they can bathe in the ocean and be resolved of the sin. So that is what it's referring to in the poetry, is the ocean, the sea can wash away all evils and all sins. But as a consequence, then, the ocean, if it can wash away all the evils, then it's as if the evil doesn't stick to the human, right? So there's a way in which it absolves the sin. And so it's fascinating because it's very similar to what happens with the Ganga as well at a structural comparative level. And Kimberly Patton argues, I think, effectively and persuasively, that underlying belief system in ancient Greek mythology is what underlies Western secular practices. So even if it doesn't seem as religion and ecology is implicitly central to the working through of religion and ecology, this ancient Greek myth actually brings it to the center. So why, for example, do we believe that the ocean can absorb millions and millions of tons of plastic? Kimberly, Professor Patton argues that it's this very idea that the sea can wash away everything from 2,500 years ago, from ancient Greek mythology, that underlies Western secular practices of imagination that the sea can absorb whatever human beings can give it. And in other words, the sea, like the Ganga as a goddess, acts as a kind of reservoir of infinity. So once you impute infinity to a mountain, to the underground, the earth goddess, Bhudevi, for example, or Gaia, the ancient Greek goddess, or the ocean, gods in ancient Greek mythology, human beings no longer can see even the pollution that they cast out into the sea. So I wanted to just put that as a background to what I'm speaking with today, that I'll be going into more depth. So I wanted to just share, to begin with, this book that just came out last year called Feeding 1,000 Souls, Women, Ritual, and Ecology in India. It's with Oxford University Press. And I'm still, because of the pandemic, it was supposed to come out last summer with OUP Delhi, but there's still, because of the printing presses were stopped in India, it was affected by that. So I'm still waiting to hear from OUP Delhi as to what the timeline might be. So I will certainly inform your college when that is, and you can inform your people. So let me go ahead and move to Feeding 1,000 Souls. And let's go to share the screen. Okay. So I just want to make sure, can everyone see this?
Yes, madam, we can.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Good. Wonderful. So this was something that I really started in a way as a project, as a part of my childhood. I was born in a village in South India, the village of Yanangudi. So a Hindu in a Muslim village, because my grandfather was a principal of a high school there, Yanangudi High School. And then I moved, my parents were living in Delhi. So then I was there for 9 months in the village. And then I went to Delhi, and then I was there for 5 years. And then we moved to the United States in 1966. And then I was there for 4 years. And then we went back to Delhi for a few years. And then we came back to the United States. So it was kind of this very deeply bicultural childhood. And throughout it all, my mother, wherever we lived, whether it was in our ancestral village in Rattagudi in Tanjavur district, or it was in Delhi at a government flat, or in Washington, D.C. in a suburban townhouse, my mother always made the kolam every single morning. So even in the snow in Maryland, in the winter, she would go out, even with her bare feet and scrape the snow. And she had a bottle with rice flour, and she would make the rice flour. So as I was growing up, I was always curious, what does the kolam mean? And why does my amma do this every morning wherever we live? But at that point, it was just a question, and it was not a curiosity that I thought I would pursue as part of my life work. And then there was a man who was named Ivan Illich, a philosopher who's written many books on education, deschooling society, medical nemesis, energy and equity. And I highly recommend, especially for climate work, I recommend his book, Energy and Equity, as well as his amazing book called Tools for Conviviality. And then I also recommend his book, H2O and the Waters of Forgetfulness, which is a history of the perception of water as sacred in the West, and about the history of the toilet, history of waste, history of smells. It's a poetic book about the history of waste, which I think is very foundational to our thinking about religion and ecology as a thematic. So here is, let me just keep going. Okay, here we go. So many of you may know this already. The word kolam is actually an ancient Tamil word. It appears in the Sangam poetics, but it doesn't refer to this particular design tradition. It really refers to the idea of form or structure. So that's how it's used in ancient Tamil Sangam poetry. But it means beauty, it means form, it means play, disguise, and ritual design. And this is during Pongal in actually Tanjavur itself. And so this research really was over a period of many years. I did almost like 10 years of field work in India from between 1987 and 1998. And it's always like, even in 2005, and every time even when I'm doing other research projects, like I'm working on sacred mangroves now, the kolam is always a part of my being, in a sense. So here, this is where I did my field work, all these different sites. So of course, Chennai, Chidambaram, Salem, Uti, Kotagiri, Coimbatore, Erode, and a lot of work in Tanjavur and Madurai and Srivilliputtur, as well as in Tirunelveli as well. And this was done by a beautiful graphic artist named Molly Roy. And I wanted to just give a little bit of a sense of a mapping of women's ritual art in India. So we have the Mandana in Rajasthan, Satya in Gujarat, Rangoli, of course, in Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Karnataka, and all through the world, Alpana in Bengal, and which, of course, the Tagores were very involved also in restoration, and then Chitta in Orissa, and then Mugu in Andhra Pradesh, and Kolam in Tamil Nadu, and then Rangavali, of course, in Karnataka as well. And there are many, many more. This is just a glimpse of some of them. What's fascinating here is that the words are very different. So it's very difficult to figure out the origin of these designs. We have some references in the Vedas from 1200 BCE, but they seem to be of independent origin. And each design tradition has its own family and river of designs. So they don't really overlap much. And then I wanted to put them in the context of global ephemeral ritual art designs. So you have the sand mandalas of Tibet, which many of you might have seen. And then also in Africa, you have the Sona ritual drawings from Angola. You have the sand paintings from the Navajo in the Southwest. And then, interestingly enough, there is something called the Combs or chalks from Wales and England. Again, these are all independent traditions, but overlapping with our kolam and our ephemeral ritual art designs. And these are from, of course, very many different traditions, religious traditions, but very similar in terms of type. I'm just going to skip this because most of you have probably seen the kolam, so I don't want to. So this was an amazing kolam that was done in Mailadurai. And I spent some time there as well. In Mayaram was the old name. And you can see that this is one continuous line with an array of dots laid down. And what I discovered also, what I learned is that there was actually a very good teacher of mine named C.V. Sheshadri, who ran an institute called MCRC, Murugappa Chettiar Research Center, Photosynthesis and Energy Division, where I was an intern in 1981. So when I saw him in 93, he had a stack of books that he gave me on mathematics and the kolam. So Professor Sheshadri said, Vijaya, you have to deal with mathematics on the kolam, otherwise your work will not be complete. And so there's tremendous work in mathematics on the kolam, and one can easily do a whole book just on that. And I have one chapter on that, on fractals, symmetry, and infinity, and array grammars, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. This is my mother, Pichamal Nagarajan, and this seed of this work really started with the Festival of India in 1985. And this is where the Smithsonian invited me to speak about the kolam, and my mother made the kolam in the Washington Mall. And so that's how I got interested in it as well. And this is a village near Chidambaram. And so this was a Pongal. Every winter I would go for, of course, a month of Margari, and Pongal I would spend in different areas throughout Tamil Nadu. And so this is one of the slides from that village. Here, this is Tanjavur, and you see it's also very collective. It's not just an individual presentation of beauty. And the two key goddesses that three gods and goddesses actually. Ganesh is one of the key, of course, remover of obstacles, and then Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth and good health and alertness. And then of course, it's also for the goddess Bhudevi, the earth goddess, to ask her for forgiveness for stepping and walking on her throughout the day, which I have a whole chapter called Embedded Ecologies. So I think that's a really interesting phenomena of how ecology is embedded within religious traditions. And we also have to ask ourselves a meaningful question of, is that sufficient? It's necessary, but is that sufficient in terms of making us act in conservational ways? And I would say sometimes yes, sometimes no. For example, the threshold would be clean and purified and made auspicious in the morning, but soon after, trash could be thrown just on the side of the kolam. So there was not a sense of contradiction between throwing of the trash and the cleaning of the threshold and making that an auspicious space. So you can have both going on at the same time. I love this one. This is an amazing photograph because it really shows also the abundance of the kolam. One of the concepts that I work a lot with, and it's throughout this book, is the notion of the commons. So, when we talk about the commons in Tamil, for example, we think about podu, what is held in common. And every Tamil, every Indian language and every language around the world has their own language to describe that which we share together. And what is interesting about the concept of the commons is that it's not just what we share together, whether it's the air, atmosphere, etc., but what are the rights and responsibilities for that shared resource, right? And so here what you see is a kind of sign. The kolam, I think, is a real sign of abundance. It's not a signed individual kolam. It's not a piece of art. It has aesthetics embedded within it, but it's not seen as purely art. So here we have, again, it's when you see this lotus flower expanded, what women said to me was that the kolam was like a catching a fold of the cloth of infinity. For a few brief moments in the morning, you capture that infinity through the kolam. And so you can see the kolam, this particular one especially, you can imagine it expanding to infinity. And mathematicians also talk about infinity on the kolam as well. So there were some areas of mathematics on the kolam that matched with what mathematicians spoke about, and then others where it was distinctive between what women spoke about their understanding of the mathematics of the kolam versus mathematicians. So besides the notion of infinity, the notion of symmetry was something that both women spoke about in their oral knowledge of the kolam, and then also mathematicians spoke about it as well. See here, I just wanted to show like the variety of ages. My mother is 80, almost 85 now, and she was doing the kolam until she was 80. So there's a way in which, like, you can see the folding of the back. It's almost like a dance, like a choreographic movement. And that really fascinated me. I worked closely with Chandralekha, who is a dancer and choreographer in my work on the kolam. And she used the kolam a lot in her sort of radical choreographic traditions in terms of the structure, the form of what she conceptualized and what she created on stage. And here what's interesting is, it's sacred, but then bicycles can go on it and cars can go on it. And it's sacred for some time, but not permanently. So I came up with a concept called intermittent sacrality to help explain this kind of off and onness of the presence of sacrality in space. And this is again a comparative religious concept, not just to Hinduism. Here you see again, like the square column. I have a whole design chapter as well that describes the sort of main typology of the design tradition. And here you see again the expansion of the lotus flower, and you can imagine it going to infinity. And this is an interesting one in terms of architecture. It's almost like a fold out top view of gopurams. And so this is a version of the square or the katakolam. So I wanted to just share that as well. And again, you see this is Pongal in its height. So you see the Pongalo Pongal and the rice festival. This happens throughout Tamil Nadu. And it's also a solar festival, an honoring of the sun as well. And you see that happening both in the time and space. And I have a chapter on that as well. So temporality in terms of the early morning, in terms of Brahmamurti, the time between 4:30 and 6 in the morning, when the kolam is done to honor the sun, so that the first rays of the sun should enter the first threshold of the house, and the kolam should be there to catch the sun. So that's what many women said to me as well. And also, I became fascinated with kolam competitions. So there was amazing kolam. I could have done a whole book on just kolam and kolam competitions. Oops, sorry. There could be a whole book on just kolam and kolam competitions. So it's something, there's a kind of playfulness and a playful competition that is there as well. This is a girls' competition for an Andal festival in Madurai. And again, you have pictorial as well. So you have also pictures of both secular as well as sacred objects in the kolam. And here's a Swiss girl. So and here, I love these temple elephants and mahouts. And so I really started noticing all the ritual marks and designs, throughout the culture and throughout the society. And one of the chapters that I think I'm most was one of my, so each chapter was like a puzzle of what women taught me from their oral knowledge, and then how to piece it together with what we know in terms of written knowledge. So that was part of the methodological challenge of this project, because there was few written materials on the kolam. So one of the things that women constantly told me was the main reason that they did the kolam was to feed 1,000 souls. And I just was, at one level, that makes sense. That, we also feed crows. We have that practice of feeding animals just with rice. So this is actually the Mylapore Kovil in Chennai. And this is often done every day by many worshippers. They'll just come and give rice to the birds. And that happens throughout India. But the idea of the kolam was if every Hindu household is supposed to feed 1,000 souls every single day. But most people are not able to feed a human being, 1,000 human beings. They're not wealthy enough. But it's good enough for your karma to feed 1,000 animal souls. So ants and earthworms and birds and squirrels and small creatures can eat up the kolam. And that's part of the reason why it's gone a few hours later. So here you see a close-up of a woman making a kolam, and you see the hand. It's actually a really tough thing to learn. It's not easy to learn. I love this one as well. This is with the wet rice flour. And this is in the Madurai Meenakshi Kovil. And again, you see one continuous line around a grid of dots. So that's, again, extremely mathematically very complex. And mathematicians and computer scientists are using the kolam for their own discoveries. And that's one of the unusual things about the kolam. It is a women's folk art, but it's one of the rare folk arts that are actually contributing actively and intellectually to sort of Western systemic knowledge traditions. And we have many mathematicians in Tamil Nadu and who've also contributed to this as well. So here's a whole idea of the fractals and the reproduction of the kolam. And so this is from that mathematics chapter. And again, this is also very similar as well. And again, you can see the symmetry, even the half mirror symmetry of this. And I love this one. This is an amazing, this is in Mailaduturai as well. Again, one continuous line, and she was 14 years old, this kolam maker, and it took her maybe 2 hours to make this kolam. And again, you can see it was done in the dark in the shadow of a kerosene lamp. So I think, back to the feeding 1,000 souls concept, I think the kolam is something that actually relieves the 5 debts that human beings are supposedly born with in terms of Hinduism. So the kolam acts as a if we're born with these debts, to our ancestors, to our parents, to our teachers, to the earth itself, and to other animals, then the kolam, by feeding 1,000 souls, actually relieves some of that accumulated debt. One of the surprising discoveries for me, or learnings for me of this work, was that when we build a house in Hindu society, it's considered to be one of the most destructive things that one can do. And the reason for that is when you build a house, say in the forest, you have to destroy the houses of many other species in order to build our human house. And that act of building our house is considered to be one of the greatest sins within ancient Hinduism in terms of the Dharma Shastras. And so this kolam is a kind of reminder, a daily reminder, that by choosing to build a house and becoming a householder, that you're actually, you've destroyed all the households of all these species. So in a sense, the least you can do every day is to remember that the house that you've built is, in a way, on the backs of all these animal species and making them homeless. So the kolam, in a sense, is the feeding 1,000 souls is partly to feed the 1,000 animal souls that you may have displaced from their own homes. And you can't relieve that sin, even if you live the best moral, ethical life. But by creating the kolam, you can relieve some of that debt. And that whole idea just blew my mind. I mean, I've studied many religious traditions in my work as a religious studies scholar, Native American religious traditions, and of course Christianity and Buddhism, but I've rarely seen that kind of sensitivity to what it means to become a householder and the consequences of taking on that task as a householder. And of course, most of you know that the householder stage also supports the forest dweller, forest stage, all the other stages, the student stage, etc. So the householder has a huge responsibility to give back to society, as many of you know. And I think one of the things I also realized through this work is that the kolam is an example, one of many examples within Hinduism, of a concept that I call rituals of generosity. So I think one of the things about the market economy that we are all embedded in is, in the last 500 years, that the market economy cultivates, and economists talk about this, very openly, it cultivates a sense of selfishness and greed, right, by its very operation. So what these, I think, rituals of generosity can do, like the kolam, but not just the kolam, but any kind of habit that we have of a ritual of generosity, can be critical right now in terms of us figuring out how to solve the problem of climate, for example. How do we solve it keeping in equity in mind and ethics in mind? And how do we have energy to the millions of people who don't have electricity yet? And then how does one constrain or encourage a more judicious use of energy from those who have access to abundant amount of energy, right? And so how does one cultivate that awareness? And I think one of the possible ways is to cultivate rituals of generosity, such as the kolam. And there's hundreds of examples like this. And so it's really, I think each culture and each religious tradition must look at its own moral and ethical resources, and both in poetry, in ancient ritual texts, and to kind of reinterpret the hermeneutics of these traditions for the contemporary moment. And I think this is extremely urgent work, extremely necessary work. And I think every citizen, of every country can take this on as well, just to re-examine their own ethical actions in relation to their own religious tradition or secular tradition, as it may be. So I want to just, this is just a glimpse of my work with this. And so I'm giving you, some various, thinkings through that I've done with this. And I just want to thank you for your kind attention. And I'm very open and eager to hear your questions. So thank you.